Hello, everybody. This is Tim Beckley. I'm the CEO of ID Alliance, and I want to welcome you to the BrandQ webinar on You Are Fired, Why Printers Fire Brands. I appreciate everyone joining us from wherever you are in the world. I want to remind everybody that they can ask questions at any time during this WebEx, and we'll answer the questions at the very end. And also, we'll send out this recording after the WebEx to every one of the attendees, and also to all the attendees who have signed up for the WebEx and who weren't able to attend will receive a copy of this as well. One of the biggest things, well, first of all, I'd like to welcome one of the people not on the course today is Ron Ellis. He's on his way to Taipei to do a G7 certification training in our office over there. But I'd like to welcome our three panelists today. We thank them for their time and giving their time for these very important webinars to the industry. And we have Jack Frank, who's the Color Process Manager in North America for Multi-Packaging Solutions. Rich Klein, who's the Color Manager for Rohr Corporation. And then Bill Pope, who's the Director of Graphic Reproduction Excellence at Kerastar. So we really appreciate all of you being on this webinar and taking the time to present your expertise and knowledge of this subject, as you have all have deep experience with this. You know, when Ron and I had talked about this topic, it was kind of twofold, looking at it from a global glance and also from certainly a North American glance as well. This year, ID Alliance has conducted 29 certifications around the world, and we've certified over 500 individuals. And I was looking at just last week that I flew 232,000 miles this year all over the world, and realizing that in every place I go to, I'm working with the largest brands in the world and the largest print service provider in the world, and also some of the smallest print service providers in the world. And we're always having the same conversations about quality and communication and evaluation and validation. And it's kind of unique and also kind of strange sometimes, because you go into meetings sometimes with expectations of knowledge of what you think you walk into a meeting, maybe sometimes with the largest brand in the world. And what you find out is that entire scope of the meeting needs to be changed, because you need to start at a different level of a conversation with the brand that you thought you were going to have. And it might be the same that you're having with a service provider. And when we talk with service providers around the world, everything is a lot of times perceptual and quality. And I often talk about, and we talk about in the world of color management, and it's obviously something that's so prevalent in the industry today. It's not geek speak. It's something that's utilized. And color management kind of could be changed to ego management sometimes, but it really comes down to process control and what you're doing with it and how you're using it and how you're measuring it. And because empirical data doesn't lie. And at the end of the day, how brands work with printers is really a relationship on communication and expectations. And I find this everywhere we go and everything we do globally as an organization, that it all consists of that. And it really starts from the very beginning of that. And when we look across the board that we work with, the very first thing is finding qualified vendors, and then the communication channel, making sure that's open. And the third thing, evaluation, of setting those expectations of what is being evaluated and making sure the evaluation is set between the brand and the service providers. And thirdly is validation, how that's done. But it all comes back to communication. And sometimes expectations are to a place, oftentimes through misunderstanding or not communicating color or expectations correctly or in a way that is effective, that printers simply sometimes walk away from business. Packaging is growing by leaps and bounds globally, double digits around the world. And what we see globally is that there are places in the world that people are taking their bottom 20% of brands and they're simply terminating those relationships because of difficulties, and the fact that maybe perhaps that they don't appreciate the work that they do, and maybe it's an unreasonable relationship. So today we're going to delve into all of that, and with our panelists on the line today, they've got incredible expertise in this because they work with the largest brands in the world and they run this every single day. So with that, and in kind of maybe putting people on the spot, because we didn't talk about what order we're going in, I'll just look at my screen and maybe Jack Frank with Multi-Packaging Solutions, they manage an extraordinary amount of brands work. So Jack, can you speak at a pretty good length about this?
Absolutely, Tim. And I think you are spot on with what you said in your introduction. At the end of the day, print suppliers, printers, we want to partner with brand owners. And like any partnership, communication is key. And both print buyers and print suppliers need to listen to what each other is saying. The other key point that you brought up is expectation, right? The expectations have to be reasonable and achievable, because if an expectation is unrealistic in the manufacturing process, it leaves both the printer and the print buyer feeling frustrated.
Right. How often do you find yourselves, and I know who your customer base is because we work so deeply with your organization around the country and the world. How often do you find yourself going back to the brand and readjusting expectations or talking about tolerances, especially if you take a new brand?
It does happen from time to time when we're struggling to hit targets. We will have a conversation with the brand and talk about the expectation. Typically, the targets that are asked of us are achievable, and we don't have any real issue. It fits right into our existing process, and we're able to deliver what the customer wants. But from time to time, there'll be an ask. Maybe it's because a color target doesn't quite work on a particular substrate, like maybe a met poly or a silver mylar. And the brand is usually very willing to listen to what the issue is and resolve the issue. For example, I gave the example of printing on met poly on a silver substrate. You can't have the same Pantone targets that were created on a white substrate when you're printing on a silver substrate. You have to adjust the target, correct for that substrate, and then you can measure and be within tolerance.
Yeah, absolutely. We see that a lot. We see the adjustment from color if it's going from the LAB values of pre-finishing to what the LAB values should be post-finishing as well. Oftentimes those are left out. So the expectation is set in advance, saying there's some confusion that, let's say, a post-finishing, it should look like this, when reality, if you're doing like a laminate or a coating, it's completely different. And then sometimes you have to go back to a brand and say, this is how you set that up for these types of conditions. And we find ourselves often having conversations like that of preparation. So education is paramount in the world that we live in, so things go seamlessly. I don't know if you agree with that.
Absolutely, and I think that's something that BrandQ really is addressing, right? I mean, BrandQ is dealing both with the print buyer and the print supplier. And in terms of the print buyer, it's giving them an understanding of the process, what an acceptable match is relative to the stock that it's on, and giving them the vocabulary to have that meaningful conversation between the brand and the printer.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so it's a global language of the same thing. It doesn't matter the colloquial language. Yeah, absolutely. Rich, how about you? I mean, you're in the same type of position in the types of brands that you deal with. What do you see in your space and your experience?
Typically, what's happening with us is we'll get a lot of graphics come in, and we'll do the basic checks and balances. Uh, and then sometimes the expectations change. It's kind of like what we're talking about here with different substrates. You'll get that expectation. You have to go back and talk with them, and really what it's all about is partnering with them and the language, like Jack said. It's part of how we come back to the customer and actually help them understand. And we've had many customers where we've had around for many, many years that didn't understand the language. And then once we went in, we did a quick visit at their facility to see what their interpretation is. And once you know that, then everybody starts to understand why we ask questions in different ways so that we can target those colors on different substrates. And like you said, with coatings can we just experienced that this week. We brought up a new customer and put some different coating on, and it really just flattened everything out. So it's really show and tell sometimes, and people learn more by seeing in person. That's where I kind of like to go in and talk with them and show them different types of printing that we've done for different areas and how we can help them accomplish what they need.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, is to bring them in and walk them through, what it is you've done and do and the process is, because there is that part where, seeing, is believing. We always say at ID Alliance, if you move through your head, through your heart, through your hands, the adoption is much easier, and you can see things more quickly. I was two things stand out in my mind this year, among a lot of things, but I was working with this extraordinary large brand, and they were showing me the proofs that they do, and they produce about 500,000 proofs a year, and they brought it in for us to see them, and they were just simply looking at them in a conference room, and that's how they look at them under conference lighting. And I asked them if this is how they do it, and they said, yeah, we can see the difference. And it was just that eyeballing type of thing, and they were running all kinds of different targets, and then the conversation quickly changed. And another conversation with another brand that we helped them with their global supply chain, and they used to have one of their own facilities or multiple facilities. They never had any type of measurement tools in any of their facilities around the world, and they had called us about this, and I was really kind of taken back by that because of who they were. I was flat out astonished, to be quite honest with you, and of how, as supply chains grow, sometimes they become more broken, and sometimes you don't realize what's going on inside of them until you really stop and start to measure and see where things are. And a lot of times people work with people, you might have 25 people in your supply chain, you might have 300, 400, 900 people around the world. But, the checks and balances of everybody communicating the same thing, having quality measurements in place and certifications, and certainly, absolutely, process control is paramount. And if everybody's working from the same language, it makes it easier. And as we travel the world, just because of the unique type of work we do, we find it to be all over the place, and it's a very unusual myriad of kind of piecing things together. In some parts of the world, you find it to be very concentric and together. In other parts of the world, it's very disconnected, and yet they believe it's correct. So, and I was talking with Bill about this the other day when we were catching up, because I hadn't talked to him in a while, and he was sharing a similar experience. So I don't know, Bill, you want to chime in?
Sure. Specific to what, Tim?
Well, we're talking about lighting, and
oh, yeah.
You can talk about anything you like to talk about, Bill. Just like to hear your voice.
Sure. No. Well, to that point, Tim, you're right. It blows me away to this day still in 2018 that we're still talking to customers about standard viewing conditions. And, we all know how inkjet proofs have taken over hard copy proofing. And look, people don't know what they don't know, but I'm sure most of us on the call realize that if we're not looking at proofs versus press sheets under standard lighting, we're creating problems right there. I mean, I've had customers that will look at one print run versus another, and it's, pigment to pigment, press sheet to press sheet. And under that, I don't get too worried about the lighting. But when you're talking about inkjet proofs that are made with dyes with different spectral reflectances than the pigments and the inks, there's a metameric match that'll only happen under D50. And if you're there in office lighting and you're complaining about color, I do it politely, but I don't want to have a conversation about a mismatch unless we're talking about standard lighting. So, I mean, I told Tim the other day, it's a 101, level 101 thing to me, or basics, but maybe it isn't. And so, I think the earlier comments, communication's key, but I think education is paramount, because we have a lot of new people coming into the industry, and if they haven't learned some of these fundamental principles, we could be sitting here debating color issues when maybe there aren't any. So, and I'll pause for now, Tim, but I got some other thoughts when there's time.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, across the board, and especially globally, when you look at specifications, you look at what measurement parameters are being utilized, and that could be the great unknown. That could be the communication barrier that is holding back a relationship between a service provider and a brand, not knowing it, or maybe not making it clear, or simply not being on the same page with it. I have seen in certain situations, and we've been called in to communicate or kind of be an intermediary, because a service provider is apprehensive to approach a brand and say, hey, you sent us these specifications, but they're really not what they should be, and because they're not applicable to this sort of type of printing, be it a standard that doesn't apply to a certain type of print application, or the measurements that were set up, parameters are not aligned with one another, and they're not fluid, or they don't flow correctly as they should from an auditing standpoint. And I always encourage them that to approach the brand and have that channel of communication. So I tell the brand, I said, sure, we'll certainly have the phone call, but to get connected with them, because that channel of communication is what is going to make or break the relationship. And I don't know if all of you run into that before, or any apprehension or concern about going back to a brand.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, Tim, I think it goes back to, the relationships you build with your customers, the rapport, the trust that you hopefully instill with them. And if you have the right kind of relationship, you should be able to have an honest communication about what's going on, whatever the issue might be. But I mean, the thing that I guess frustrates me, there's probably two big categories for me that frustrate me with this topic of today's webinar. And the first is a lack of consistency among customers in terms of their expectations. And, we'll have what might work for one customer may not work for another. And look, customers are free to have different levels of expectations. I'm okay with that. But the second big category then that ties in with that is what are our true process capabilities? You know, are we going to be able to deliver at a consistency level that's going to be acceptable for them? And honestly, I don't want to speak for everybody else, but I think as an industry, we haven't done a good enough job of quantifying our true process capabilities, and then more importantly, drawing a correlation between that objective data and the visual results. I mean, what's crazy about our business is that as much as we want to put numbers on spot colors and densities and, delta E's and TVI and gray balance, I mean, we can quantify all that good stuff. That's great. But how do we correlate that to the final visual results? And I think about it in kind of two categories. Spot colors are one thing. That's pretty simple, thankfully. And that's very popular in packaging, of course. But the other big bucket is process color work, 4-color process. And I mean, again, we can quantify, the color of the solids, the overprints, gray balance. We can quantify registration and make sure everything looks good. But what we do within our process capability might meet one customer's expectations, but not another. And as we enter into a new relationship with a customer, how do we have that kind of conversation up front to say, hey, here are our metrics, here's what we measure, here's how we do it. Is that going to work for you? I mean, most customers can't even have that kind of conversation. So, the approach that we've taken is to, kind of benchmark what our process is doing every day. We've got good scanning spectros on all our sheet fed presses and, however we get the measurements. But then as we can build that data and those trend lines, then we can go back with the customer and say, all right, here's the normal visual color variation, and here's the numbers that go along with that. And is that working for you? And you can kind of negotiate and work for it. But obviously the last thing we want to do is agree to tolerances that are tighter than what our process is capable of. Because then we're just going to do the age-old hand-pick samples and make them feel good about what they think they're getting, and hopefully they don't look at everything. And, I know we all play these games from time to time, but at the end of the day, we've got to have some honest conversations with our customers about the reality of our process or our processes, but we've also got to understand what our processes are doing first. I mean, I'm all for communicating, but it's what we communicate that's important. And if we don't have a fundamental understanding of our print metrics and how they correlate to the visual result, what are we supposed to say to our customers to, build that confidence and enlighten and educate them on what's truly possible with our process?
Yeah, well stated. Jack, you were going to say something there.
I think I'm going to add to that statement. Every brand is probably one consultant away from adopting some sort of print quality program. And I agree. I think that a print quality program is great, provided that the program is in line with existing best practices and standards that most printers are already using. I think the industry has pretty well defined what reasonable tolerances are, and what we should be measuring when it comes to like CMYK color. We're looking at the solids, and we're looking at the overprints, and we're looking at gray balance and TVI. Most people have this incorporated in their color bars to make sure that they're in line with with the standards that they're measuring against and matching their proof. But the danger is when the customer has expectations that are outside what is capable in the manufacturing process, and those unrealistic expectations can damage that partnership between the brand owner and the printer, and make everyone feel extremely frustrated with the process, even lose faith in the process of measuring, standardizing, and measuring and process control.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's dual-sided. You look at, sometimes it really comes down to the basics of tools and measurements, M1, M0, whatever it may be, or even lighting, D50, D65. That could be all over the place, and there are many situations where there might be a converter or a printer who doesn't have knowledge and might be scared to speak up because they're scared of losing the business, and that's where it's very important to have that education as well. And there's incredible amounts of brands with incredible amount of knowledge, and there's incredible amount of service providers with incredible amounts of knowledge, but there's also incredible amounts of both that really need almost down to at times having basic fundamental color management conversations. We have found ourselves in conversations with people globally on both sides, where again we're asked to come to a meeting and consult, and we've prepared presentations because of who we're meeting with, and we think it's a high level conversation where we're having to literally in the middle of the meeting backtrack the conversation because we're going to be taught. We find out that we really need to have a 5,000 foot view conversation about color management, not talking about standards and parameters and everything that goes along with it, because it's there's just a giant gap, and it kind of takes us off guard quite a bit, and and that's where it's okay to speak up. I think people often find themselves feeling like they have to know the answer. It's kind of like when you're in a room of training, or that people are scared to raise their hand and say, well, I don't know what that means. Or if you ask somebody in a training, can you please walk me through what the deltas are? Most people wouldn't know, and that's okay, but those are important things. And we have to help and seek out that information. It's not seeking that information that makes things kind of go off the rails. It's not about necessarily technology does all the work and the software does all the work. It's not true. There's a great deal amount of human interaction in our industry, which is very, very different than most industries in the world. I don't know if Rich or Bill or anybody wanted to chime in.
Well, yeah, I think that's very true. We've had, like you said, some brands that understood color to what their designers knew, and once they started seeing the difference in how they perceive color, how they measure color, we ran into device agreement problems where they're using a spherical unit to measure color LAB, but it's different than the 045 unit. And when that happens, their expectations are, okay, we want this LAB value to be within a certain delta E, and then they were measuring it one way, we were measuring it another, and it caused so much confusion because they just couldn't wrap their arms around the fact that these numbers, yes, they are target, but when we don't have the devices all lined up and synchronized so that they all see the same way, it was just a real battle. We went back and forth for a couple of years with one certain brand, and then when we convinced them to purchase the devices that our industry uses instead of what theirs was using for the graphics and some of their plastics and other things, that was a big thing for us.
Yeah. Do you find with the type of work, because I know the type of work that you all do, obviously not every customer that you work with, but do you find that brands that you work with and people that you supply product to, do they bring you print buyer requirements in contracts to sign, or is it more of a contract fulfillment and that sort of thing?
Tim, for us, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah, with us, it's a little both. And when that happens, we have to take into account what their knowledge base is. Even though they have a spec that they want to follow, is that really doable? Is it something that our equipment, has that capability? And sometimes you really have to walk the walk with them and help them through the process, because sometimes the higher level, it comes down from their end of management, and then when it gets to ordering what their product they need, it doesn't correlate, and it's such a big gap.
Mm-hmm. I thought somebody else was going to chime with Jack.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, this is Bill. Yeah, so I was going to say, at least for our part of our segment, in folding carton packaging, typically we're not seeing customers write quality specs into the contracts, whether it's color or runnability of the carton, score bends, COF, things like that. So quality attributes can't say I've seen them in any of our contracts. It's typically around pricing and service and vendor controlled inventory, that kind of VMI, that kind of thing. So, but what I've seen our customers do more and more of the past years, somebody mentioned print quality programs out there. I think it was Rich. A lot of our customers have partnered with the third-party print quality systems out there, and I won't name them all. There's probably too many to name now these days. And I get the spirit of it, but the challenge that it presents for us oftentimes is that as we run different customers in the same plant on the same process, we may have to switch to different kinds of approaches in order to conform and comply to these different print quality programs, whether it's, different sampling frequency or measuring different attributes or whatever. And frankly, it drives us nuts because we'd like to have a standardized process, but then, our customers are demanding that we conform to these programs. And oftentimes it's secondary after the fact measurements where, again, we'll have a scanning spectro on press that we'll use to measure a color bar. We'll control the process. We'll collect all the good data. But then in order to provide data to whoever on the outside, we've got to go do secondary measurements, and sometimes with a completely different instrument because that's what's been specified. And honestly, I get the value proposition, but I'm not sure it's really there at the end of the day. So, that's why things like PQX are exciting to us because, we're all for sharing data, but I'd rather do it out of a one-time measurement than having to do this extra labor, non-value added secondary measurement and just share the data. And if the print quality providers out there want to compete on the merits of their system, I have no problem with that. I just don't want to run 3 or 4 different print quality systems in the same plant and try and juggle that chaos.
No, good point. Yeah, and with having multiple facilities, like some of you have, hundreds of facilities. How do you maintain process control and in keeping things aligned across your multiple facilities? I know I talked to Jack, recently, and I talked to Jack quite a bit, but I know things that you're doing. Maybe you could talk about them a little more because it's as your businesses grow and you're your own groups and continue to make acquisitions. How are you holding your own groups accountable and making sure they're aligned to one another because you're passing work in between different facilities?
That's a great question. We have a color management strategy that we've rolled out to all of the facilities, or in the process of rolling out to all the facilities in North America and in Europe and in Asia. And we're actually combining that with WestRock to share these solutions and share these strategies so that everyone is presenting the same face to the customer. The easiest way to do that is to audit a facility, make sure they have the right tools, the right software, and the right training. But after that, it's a matter of standardizing CMYK and putting in the process controls to make sure that our CMYK is standardized to the same standard that's shared throughout the fleet, and as well as spot color standardization, utilizing things like the Pantone digital libraries and colorimetric evaluation rather than a visual interpretation. And at the end, we're moving more and more facilities to like the next step past that, which is extended gamut standardization.
Yeah, which actually I was going to just bring up. Thanks for a great segue, Jack. But the ECG, you know, we've the Alliance and the task force, the Print Properties and Colorimetric Council, and everybody on that from a global standpoint, and all the suppliers that have been involved in creating the world's first test target for that. It's an incredible market, and it's been obviously talked about for an extraordinary amount of time. Can you guys talk about the adoption ratio of brands moving the ECG and away from spot colors?
Well, I have seen, markets that had never been interested in extended gamut printing re-looking at it, taking a good, fresh look at EG, particularly as large companies are looking for ways to reduce costs, to what can they do to reduce the packaging costs overall? And I think as digital printing becomes more prevalent in our industry, and digital printing at its heart is really extended gamut, and as people accept that quality, the simulations that come from digital printing, I think more and more companies are going to reevaluate extended gamut as a very viable option to reduce their packaging costs without sacrificing brand recognition or print quality.
Yeah, it's a good answer. Bill, I know you've got a lot of expertise and we talk about this a lot, and you have a lot to say. I'm surprised you didn't chime in straight away, because you deal with this.
Yeah, I was going to let Jack go because I know he led into it earlier, but I'm trying to watch my time. No, lots to say there. I guess, ECG or expanded gamut's an interesting approach, and like Jack said, there's a lot of operational savings that can be done there. Trying to think where to go. I mean, we deal with a number of private label suppliers, if you will, where they make private label products, and so they'll deal with 200, 300, 400 retail locations, and so there's kind of two layers of customers. So it's one thing to sell our customer on it, but then they have to go out and sell it to all of their customers. And I think one of the challenges we've had with expanded gamut is we're going to already established spot colors out there, or brand colors, and don't think that expanded gamut can hit every color under a delta E of 2 or whatever you want to set it at. So there are challenges there. But even if you can get, I've done the numbers on a few of our plants and our customers, we can typically hit about 93% of the spot colors being used with our expanded gamut approach. And that's pretty darn good. It's not a binary thing where either everything has to go EG or nothing can. So you can get great benefits there. But there's actually one story I'd like to tell that is a newer thing for me, I guess. I mean, traditionally, expanded gamut has been aimed at spot color simulations or replacements, if you will. Put the same 6 or 7 inks in the press and never change inks, just change plates, and longer runs, combined forms, fewer make-readies, all that good stuff. And that's great. One area that North America hasn't taken advantage of with expanded gamut is enhancing the imagery. I've seen this much more in Europe and other areas where you can actually enhance the colorfulness of the graphics on shelf. But there you're kind of limited to illustrations, like things like, think about like fruits and other things that can be very colorful. You really can't, amp up a process color image without making it look like a cartoon. So I get that there's some limited opportunity there, but still there's a lot of packaging that uses illustrations where you could get better shelf appeal if we could infuse that expanded gamut into it. But honestly, one of the realizations I've had in the past few years is that the third benefit of expanded gamut that isn't typically in the brochures is what I like to call like stabilizing the process color work. A lot of graphics out there are very volatile, especially when you have colors in between your 3 primaries of yellow, magenta, and cyan. So think about greens and blues and reds. And when you get a graphic that's roughly 50-50 of any 2 of those, that's a really volatile build. And when the 2 primaries building it are that far apart, like take a yellow and a magenta, for example, I mean, I'd be guessing at what the delta E is between those, but it's like 50 or 60 between a yellow and a magenta. And just imagine that those 2 primaries are trying to build this kind of screened color together. any variation on press, the hue is going to swing back and forth greatly, and you're going to have a lot of problems. So what we've been doing of recent time is using the expanded gamut approach to infuse those orange, green, or violet EG primaries to help stabilize the graphics. And now orange can take on a lot of that magenta yellow build that used to be just for color. And I've done some studies in the past where we've reduced our process color variation by threefold, from a delta E point of view, monitoring the run when it was just say a cyan magenta build. When we infused violet in there to help take the burden of that color, we've reduced the color variation by 3 times just by reseparating the image with expanded gamut. So maybe a little tangent there, but there's challenges with it, but there's great opportunities, not just spot color replacement or enhancing the imagery, but this stabilization of those volatile graphics out there.
Do you talk to your clients about this? Do you present that information to them? Or do you only talk to them about it if they bring it up to you?
To who are you talking about, Tim? I mean, customers?
To your customers. Do you bring it up to them, openly, or do you talk to them about it only if they only bring it up to you?
No, we bring it up where we can. I mean, we have a customer right now where we've had quality issues out of one of our plants, again, with this kind of magenta yellow graphic that was just really volatile, and it's on one of our newer presses, and we've got closed loop on it and everything we can, but the customer, and I don't think they have unrealistic expectations, but they're like, well, what can be done? We've got to improve this, and so we introduced the expanded gamut approach to them. So, and honestly, when we get to the point where we can have dedicated presses with EG, there's nothing that says we can't run all of our CMYK graphics through an EG color strategy and stabilize them. Because, I mean, I think there's a philosophical approach you need to take with your customers, meaning, do you need to tell them about everything you do to a file once you get it? I mean, for example, some printers, have the ink optimization software and various brands out there where every graphic goes through it to, kind of do like a super UCR or GCR and pull out CMY and put in black. I mean, technically, you're running a different file than what they gave you. But, philosophically, you can say, look, my job is to match the proof. How I get there is my business. And so if you take that into expanded gamut, one could also, and we've taken this approach in some cases, we don't necessarily go and tell the customer that we're going to reseparate their spot color and use expanded gamut. We're going to take the savings and opportunity ourselves, and as long as we can deliver to them a spot color, the visual within a delta E of 2, and we happen to do it with EG, and we reap the benefits of better efficiency and throughput. My feeling is that's okay to do that. Because sometimes when you start pointing things out to customers, oh, we'd like to do this or do that, number one, they're going to want to share in those savings. And in my world, our margins are not great. So we need everything we can as we try to squeeze water out of that rock. And as the contracts come up year after year with price reductions, So, but again, I think it's our responsibility to deliver the quality product, and how we get there is our business.
Really great example, and how you flew through that, Bill. I knew that given the opportunity, you'd have a lot to say on it. I don't know if anybody else quickly wanted to chime in before we move on to questions.
The only thing I would point out, just on that topic, because we're looking at extending images as well as spot color simulation, and I love the idea, and it's sort of a super GCR, right? Because you're replacing cyan and yellow elements with just green, much more stable. The issue that I usually run into, though, is that ID Alliance has done such a good job selling Grackle 2006 or Grackle 2013 that the customers aren't necessarily interested in something that looks better than a Grackle proof.
Well, we're not selling anything because we're nonprofit, but globally having 12 offices, I think people are seeing them all over the place. I appreciate the acknowledgement there. The reason we do these webinars for BrandQ is to bring education to the marketplace, and I really thank all of our panelists and everyone joining this webinar today, for being here, and Jack and Rich and Bill for all of your expertise and participation. It really helps. And BrandQ is a training program, and it's a auditing program, and it's really for the entire ecosystem, for both anybody in the packaging supply chain, and also for service providers, for the brand side, for the creative side. And you can find out more from the website. And I always say, I say this, well, I don't always say this, I say this sometimes, when there's a problem in the supply chain, be it in the service provider side or the brand side, and I said this one time overseas, and it didn't go over very well because I speak in analogies sometimes, and I said that getting somebody to admit there's a problem in the supply chain is like getting somebody into alcohol or drug rehabilitation. They know there's a problem, but they're not going to admit it. But once they do, they take one big step towards that, and that big step leads to other things, and the eyes get brighter, and things get better, and everything opens up, and everybody around and feels great relief and pats on the back. I said that overseas one time, and I really had to explain myself, which really defeated the purpose of the statement, but it very much ties into that. And as we started looking at that process of drug and alcohol treatment, it was unbelievable, the correlation of the supply chain. I guess we spend so much time in it. It was like the steps of that process of an intervention. So if you find yourself there is a solution. It's called BrandQ. But we'll get to some questions here if you don't mind fielding some, and I'll start with this one. It says, I'm a quality professional but new to print. How do I know what a capable process is versus asking for something that is just not obtainable? Should I be worried about consistent output or printing capability? And when do I know something is unreasonable?
Oh boy, I guess welcome to the world of subjectivity, I guess is what I would say. Tim, help me out. Was that from the perspective of a print buyer?
I don't know. I don't know if it's a print buyer or a printer or a brand.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's making assumption. I guess
a service provider.
Okay. Well, I guess when you're talking about dealing with a printer, I would think that you'd want to have an open conversation up front, and just as we sometimes wonder or question the technical capability of our customers in terms of what kind of conversation we can have with them, it can go the other way too. So if you're somebody, whether you're a service provider or a customer talking to a printer, I think you ask open-ended questions and see how they respond, and say, what do you do from a process control point of view? Talk to me about your process capabilities and see what kind of answers they come up with and how they talk about their procedures and stuff. Yeah, that's my suggestion. But to try and quantify something, it's hard to say. There are a lot of good standards and best practices out there and tolerances that you can use as a starting point. And in void of anything else, that's a good place to start. But again, to my earlier comment, then it's a matter of if a printer can perform to those levels of tolerances, is that result good enough for you visually at the end of the day?
Okay.
That helps.
I would think that, as a starting place, using the G7 method and the standards that ID Alliance put out there is a good place to start as well.
Yeah.
For CMYK standardization.
And the next question is, it actually starts with this, is 2 delta E a standard max limit printers are agreeing to hold? And I think we could all answer that question. I don't know who wants to field that.
Let Jack or Rich go.
This is Rich. Yeah, that's a tough question because different colors lend a little bit more window of opportunity. When you talk about pastels and lighter colors, a broader range over 2 would be detrimental. And when you get into other colors, you could get to a 2.5 or a 3 delta E, and your eyes visually wouldn't even see it. So it's kind of subjective, kind of like Bill said earlier, there's things in our processes and the way we produce our inks, and sometimes a customer has a expectation that they would like to have what we call it's a reflectivity, or maybe something that they want fade resistant. And when we get into fade resistant type issues that they would like to address, the pigments that go into that ink don't always lend it enough room for that delta E to be even attained.
Yeah. And go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I cringe whenever I hear the word standard associated with a delta E, because there is no standard for it. And I appreciate the spirit of the question, no doubt. I guess what I'd say is that, I would say oftentimes the loose agreement is about a 2 delta E that we'll hear from customers. And it's not about that we're trying to get away with anything, but obviously the larger the tolerance, the better. But realistically, between 2 and 3 is typically what we see. But again, it goes back to process capability and if that's acceptable. But, one of the things I've done, and it's a little bit of a pain to do sometimes, but when you have a large, say national account that you want to, kind of nail down well, we've produced, even off the press, sample prints, if you will, of a job, purposely pushing that spot color lighter and darker, and then, presenting those to the customer. Don't even tell them the delta E, and show it to them and say, all right, if this is the standard color, and then you start showing them steps, call it roughly half delta E steps away from a light and dark point of view, what's acceptable to you? And at some point, they're going to pick one and say, well, that's as dark as I'd want to go, and that's as light as I would want to go. Then you can put numbers on it. And I've had more cases than not where the resulting number ends up being 3.5 delta E before they object. But again, if you go into cosmetics, they'll be picking out a half a delta E. So depends on the customer. But again, I think it all ties back into what your process capable of. And if you can understand that, and there's a lot that goes into it, ink formulation, strength of ink, but everything's going to vary to some level. And it's a matter of trying to communicate that both visually and, colorimetrically or objectively to the customer. And, trying to settle on something that you can hit, and that's going to be reasonable for the customer. And if there's a mismatch there, then somebody's got to make some hard decisions there.
And that's a drift conversation. So, and an important one.
Yeah. Well, and one last point there too. It's funny when you strictly take the standard and then look at, say, a lighter or darker example or sample of a spot color. It's one thing to say, all right, I can accept that. What happens though is then the customer may take the light one, the light limit, and the dark limit, hold them against each other and say, oh, that's way too much of a difference. I can't handle that. And so then you start getting yourself into even tighter tolerances that'll typically be tighter than your process capability, and that's trouble. But I think what you need to educate the customer about is that, like, look, when you're talking about on-store shelf consistency and the visual impact, you're not going to have the light extreme and the dark extreme typically sitting right next to each other, because these processes don't jump to the upper and lower limits one sheet to the next. They're going to be longer term drifts, and there is going to be variation, but just through the manufacturing process, whether it's printing, die cutting, gluing into a box, and then through the filling line, you're not going to typically see those on the shelf. And so, is it possible? Yes, but it's just a lot there you got to kind of wrap your head around.
Something else, Tim, a lot of times the target that you're aiming for wasn't generated from ink that was fade resistant or coatable. Those two elements can really add a monkey wrench when you're trying to get a color under 2-point delta E. If the target wasn't created using fade resistant or coatable pigments, but the expectation is that the packaging that you're producing will, then you can run into real trouble there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think go ahead, Bill.
Tim, I'm sorry, just one other thought there. As you think about the entire tolerance that you have around a spot color, keep in mind that, there's other things that are going to chew away at that before you even get to press. So, ink batch to batch consistency, with our ink supplier, even if you give them a half a delta E from one batch to the next, you've now just chewed up 25% of the spec before you turn the press on. And now you've got instrument repeatability or potentially inter-instrument agreement or disagreement that could chew up another third of a delta E or more, et cetera, whether you're calibrating, certified or not. So you very well could be giving away 0.8 to 1.0 of the delta E tolerance before you even turn the press on. And so, you know, even as you isolate the press and look at its true variation and what it does just innately by itself, you've got to look at these compounding factors that really drive that up. So, you know, it's really important to understand all that so that as you go to your customer, you know, it's not just what does the color do by itself. It's the instrument, it's the measurement system, it's the batch to batch. And then I haven't even talked about substrate. And in my world with recycled paperboard, I mean, forget it. You know, so, there's so many variables there that just chew away at that spec. So that's why it's important to understand those and try and communicate those to your customer and educate. And again, not to get larger tolerances for the sake of larger tolerances, but to get realistic ones that are going to be within your capability on press on a regular basis.
Yeah. You know, I have to say I was disappointed that no one worked in the word interstitial into the conversation today. I love when that's utilized. But just a side note, but only joking. I'll tell you.
Uniformity?
Yeah. Here's another question: is what do you do when a print vendor lacks diligence or discipline? Do you give them fair warning, and in what wording? And how long do you give them to prove their ability to provide results that are stable, repeatable, and consistent? And this is from a brand. So mind your answer, you know?
Yeah. I guess us as printers may be hard to answer that. I guess what I would say, though, if I were in the shoes of a brand owner, you know, look, it's disruptive to move business. And so, you know, it's not you're just buying toner cartridges from another office supply store. To move your work to another printer comes with some level of work and trauma. So you don't want to give up on your printer too easily. But you got to have an open conversation. And, you know, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but maybe what you do is you tie their behavior and results to potentially the price or the margin. And, you know, where you start with, you say, look, if you can perform, you know, if you can perform with what we all agree to, great. Now, I don't want to get into a punitive, hey, one bad job and you get whacked. But, you know, if there's an ongoing, how a supplier responds when there's a problem, I think tells you a lot in terms of, you know, their character as a company. And because everybody's going to make a mistake. I don't care if it's a raw material supplier, a printer, a pre-press provider, even a customer may make a mistake in sending the wrong file. But the point is when there is a mistake, how do they respond? And, you know, hopefully you can have a conversation with them and not turn it into a litigious, you know, kind of black and white, you know, penalty system. But, you know, it just goes to the quality of the relationship and the partnership you have with them, I guess. But, you know, if they're not doing it for you, at some point, maybe you got to fire them.
Yeah, well, that brings us back to the title. So with that, I think it's a good point to close the webinar on. And again, you know, thank you everybody for joining the webinar today. And again, special thanks for all the panelists. I think it was a really great discussion with some really great points made, some great questions as well. I'll send this out to everyone, and we look forward to the next BrandQ webinar next month. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Steve.